This is a tactical alliance between the ANC and the DA, not a government of national unity. In 2029, the question will not be whether the ANC will fall below 50 or 40%. The question will be whether the ANC will fall below 30%.
Wow.
Ramaphosa is a dead man walking. Julius Malema is the greatest asset of the EFF. I have also argued that Julius Malema is the greatest threat to the EFF.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX, and today I bring you SMWX royalty. Back by popular demand, we have Gogo Aubrey Matshiqi, in my view, our country's premier political analyst and just a wonderful human being. Gogo, thank you for joining us. It's always a joy to have you.
Thokozani Hlubi. Let me say before we proceed, yeah.
May I say, I think that was better than Helen Zilla's yeah, but we'll have to ask her.
I had to beat Helen Zilla.
You know, this channel is starting to become quite a force, but you have been here throughout its different iterations, and we just thank you so much for always honoring this platform.
It's an honor to be associated with SMWX. I'm proud of my association with SMWX and what it is becoming.
We're extremely proud. No matter who we interview, I always get a message. Okay, that's nice, but can you just bring back Gogo? So we've delivered again. Gogo, I think the best place to start would be with this government that we have on our hands, which comes out of an election, a very specific election. And maybe we can start thinking through what the election meant and then the subsequent government that was created out of it and how you're interpreting that at the moment.
Well, I've been thinking about the emergence of the GNU quite a lot since the election and since its formation. And I've been thinking about it in terms of what is called, there's a certain level of pragmatism that imposes itself on the main components of the GNU. And that is imposed itself by another imperative, something called utilitarian pragmatism. And in the context of the GNU, what we mean is that it becomes clear that the ANC will not be able to govern alone. It also becomes clear that for the DA, an outright majority remains a bridge too far. Another thing becomes clear, that for many, many, many years to come, coalition government is going to become a feature of our politics and post-election scenarios. So this idea of utilitarian pragmatism comes to my mind in this way. Firstly, when different interests, are perfectly aligned, the need for cooperation does not arise. Precisely because the different interests are properly aligned. But when the different interests are perfectly opposed, cooperation is not possible. This election delivered neither scenario. So this election did not deliver a scenario where the different interests, particularly the interests of the ANC and the DA, are perfectly aligned. Nor did it deliver a scenario where the different interests are perfectly opposed. What it delivers is something in between the two scenarios. And why does the DA, or why do the DA and the ANC decide? The best thing to do is to form an ANC-DA coalition and do a bit of padding and call the padding, or the result of the padding, a government of national unity. Now, of course, Helen Zille keeps on reminding us that this is not a government of national unity.
Yeah.
And she is correct. In essence, this is an alliance between the ANC and the DA. I would call it a tactical, not a strategic alliance. This is a tactical alliance between the ANC and the DA, not a government of national unity. Therefore, this is a coalition, in essence, between the ANC and the DA. And tactically, they decided to invite other parties for padding purposes and call it a government of national unity. Now, the outcome of this election necessitated cooperation between the DA, primarily between the DA and the ANC. Why do they enter into this arrangement? Why do they enter into this tactical alliance? They do so because in the end, their cooperators must gain some advantage from the cooperation. In other words, by entering into a coalition, the DA and the ANC seek to gain a competitive advantage over others within this arrangement we call the GNU today. So that's the primary motive. There is no point in the DA going into a coalition with the ANC. There is no point in the ANC going into a coalition with the DA if neither is not going to gain, or if neither is going to gain advantage, a competitive advantage over the rest. So the cooperation between the DA and the ANC must deliver for the two parties a competitive advantage over the rest. This competitive advantage must be conferred to both. So both parties go into this arrangement because they want to see this competitive advantage conferred to both of them. In other words, they do understand. They did understand that it was highly unlikely that an arrangement in which only one of them achieves a competitive advantage would be a successful venture. They understood that. So they opt for an arrangement in which the two parties, the DA and the ANC together, enter into a kind of cooperation that would deliver a competitive advantage to both over the rest. That is one way in which we can explain the emergence of the government of national unity.
What do you think each party foresaw as the advantage they would gain by this cooperation?
Well, take the ANC. The ANC does a good job of ensuring that it does not negotiate itself out of power. the ANC was faced with a real threat of disappearing when it comes to the balance of power in our electoral politics in particular and our politics in general. Now, of course, we're struggling with getting used to the idea that actually the ANC did not fall below 50%. It fell below 40%. And it's on a trajectory, and if it stays on this trajectory, where in 2029, the question will not be whether the ANC will fall below 50 or 40%. The question will be whether the ANC will fall below 30%.
Wow.
Because for me, the ANC falling below 30% in 2029 is not beyond the realm of possibility. So the primary motive for the ANC and the primary reason the ANC enters into this coalition with the DA is survival. It had to survive. It has been rejected by the majority of voters. So it had to survive. And remember, I have been saying, and I still maintain, that the ANC will celebrate 200 years of its existence. And at that celebration, they will be at a cozy restaurant in Mangaung. That's how small they will be at that time. So they are on a trajectory in which inexorably, in terms of electoral support, they become smaller and smaller. So the imperative here was survival. Now, at the funeral of Tito Mboweni, Ramaphosa talks about his last interactions with Mboweni and tells that in the end, Mboweni was an unhappy man. He doesn't give us the content of Mboweni's unhappiness, but he refers to a WhatsApp exchange between them. And correctly, he says, I am not going to tell you what he said in this WhatsApp exchange because he's not here to answer for himself. I will tell you what I said. And then he proceeded to tell the story of the Black Widow. This female spider, which after mating with this male, what happens to the male after the ecstasy of orgasm. The Black Widow, the female spider, kills the male spider. And as he was talking, I was wondering in my mind, is it the ANC or the DA that is the black spider?
Sure.
Or do they both go into this GNU, into this coalition, with the aim of being a black spider? In either ways, does the ANC go into the GNU with the intention of being the black spider? And after the orgasm of setting up the GNU and the GNU surviving maybe till 2029, then the ANC in its incarnation and the black spider will kill the DA in its incarnation as the male spider that is killed by the Black Widow? Or is it the other way around? That the DA goes into the GNU arrangement intending to be the Black Widow that will kill the male, the ANC, at the end of this term in 2029. Or even before. I suspect that there is an extent to which we can credibly argue that both the DA and the ANC go into this arrangement intending to be the Black Widow. So the ANC needed to survive. And also must bear in mind that in both the ANC and the DA, there was opposition to the idea of an ANC-DA coalition.
Yeah.
In fact, if my sources are correct, in the DA, Helen Zille is one of those who cautioned the DA against the dangers of going to a coalition arrangement with the ANC, but was convinced otherwise. Of course, that is if my sources did not misinform me. In the ANC itself, there are many who were against going into a coalition with the DA, who went public and are still going public to this day. But, and this brings us to this idea of utilitarian pragmatism. For the DA, going into a coalition with the ANC was never going to be ideal. For the ANC, going into a coalition arrangement with the DA was never going to be ideal. But for both, what this arrangement does is to deliver a level of power they would not have had without the coalition. Even better for the ANC, it delivers survival. The ANC can remain part of government and the DA can become part of government without winning an election. Because I think I said to you in 2019 that the DA did stumble into the idea that it does not have to be the ruling party to have his interests or the interests of his constituency advanced. And through the GNU, the interests of the DA can be advanced. And through the GNU, some interests of the ANC can be advanced, particularly the imperative of survival. So that is what I mean when I say they both go into the arrangement with the understanding that the arrangement must confer on both a competitive advantage over the rest. But you can also come at it in terms of the unity of opposites. So you have these opposites, the DA and the ANC, that must unite in order to gain some level of power, state power. But what doesn't change is that this is a unity of opposites. And as long as these two opposites continue to occupy the same space we call the GNU, two dynamics will coincide throughout the life of the GNU. Firstly, it is the dynamic of strategic cooperation, and secondly, the dynamic of strategic competition. Each party must know where the healthy balance lies between strategic competition and strategic cooperation. Because if they get it wrong, if either of both get it wrong, the GNU collapses.
It's been a year of two halves, basically, as I see it. The first half of this year, up to the end of May, was the election, and then this opening of parliament where the speaker was elected and the president was elected. The second half of the year was the formation of the executive and the coalition government beginning in earnest. In terms of that second half, what do you make of how the government itself has performed, both politically and as a government? It hasn't broken apart, so it has survived to this point, which shouldn't be ignored. But, I mean, to say that there have been few victories so far would probably be an understatement.
Well, there have been few victories, but a lot of fake news about victories.
Sentiment is high,
yes,
but the fundamentals remain
well,
dubious at best.
what that makes me think of, you're right, sentiment is high. And that sentiment, that positive sentiment, has had a real impact in certain ways.
Absolutely. I just hope the economy keeps
Yes.
being misled, because at least then we get some benefit.
So you look at how our 10-year bond yields are performing.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
The ratings agencies.
Yeah.
Someone mustn't tell them that there are no fundamentals to back this. They must keep...
This brings me to this cartoon that Zapiro did some years ago. It is the cartoon of this couple. The woman is doing the washing. They live in a shack. So the woman is doing the washing outside the shack, and the man is reading a newspaper, a broadsheet. Let's call it SMW News. SMWX News. So the woman says to the man, honey, what's in the news? The husband says, well, my dear, they say the fundamentals are sound. But you look at them, for them the fundamentals, there's no sign, there's no sign in their lived reality that the fundamentals are sound. I think we're back there. We're back to that kind of talk. Where we say the fundamentals are sound, but they are not reflected sufficient in the lives of people.
Yeah, absolutely. But sorry, to take you back to my original question about this 6 months of the actual formation and the early days, maybe, of this government. What do you make of how it's come together, its composition, and also how it has lived for for the second half of this year?
Well, I think we must be fair in our assessment of the GNU. As you know, I was quite critical of the GNU when it was formed. Quite stressed. Like Solima Paila, I was very stressed. I think the two of us were the most stressed at the time. But we must be fair. We must not be slaves to the no. There's a point that is made by Kgalema Motlanthe to you that I agree with you. He says, one of the things the GNU does is to widen the pool of talent from which, for instance, you select members of cabinet.
Sure.
He's absolutely correct in my view. That you are no longer limited to a single party, the ANC, when you make the decision about who's going to be in cabinet. You now have a wider pool because you have more than one party from which to select members of cabinet. So for me, that is a definite positive that has been delivered by the formation of the GNU.
Sure.
Now, coming back to the balance between strategic competition and strategic cooperation in the context of this unity of opposites. Now, there are many ways in which we can characterize the reality we call the GNU. But let me isolate this one for now. So there's an extent to which what we've seen over the past 6 months is the GNU assuming a life of its own. And to some extent, that life being independent from the political parties that formed it. So there is an extent to which the GNU has operated as an entity that is independent from the ANC, that is independent from the DA, that is independent from the Patriotic Alliance and others that have formed it. You look at what is coming out of SCOPA. One of the things that have impressed me about the GNU is the work of SCOPA, actually. I think SCOPA, under the leadership of Songezo Zibi, is doing very well.
Well, I can.
Some might say Maybe I'm speaking too soon, but that's my impression at the moment.
I can reveal we have a chat with him coming up soon on the channel.
Oh, good. Good. Tell him I said so.
Yeah.
And tell him he owes me.
Yeah.
So Scopa is an example of the extent to which this GNU is independent, for instance, from the problems that come with the ANC. So you have this Scopa that seems committed to good governance. And in its commitment, seeks to arrest any sign of corruption, any sign of malfeasance, and anything that compromises the credibility of the GNU.
Yeah.
So Scopa is an example of how the GNU is beginning to assume an identity that is independent, if not from all the parties that formed it, but from some of the parties that formed it. And that is a good thing, if the example set by Scopa is anything to go by. But in terms of strategic competition and strategic cooperation, there is an extent to which the DA in particular tries to leverage strategic competition to its advantage by suggesting that to the extent that the GNU is working, it is the parts of the DNU that the DA is in charge of that are working.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you de-link, if you are the DA, you de-link the successes of the GNU from the ANC. You say, to the extent that the GNU is succeeding in certain respects, it is because of the work that is being done by DA ministers. Now, I'm not going to quibble too much with that, because that is not completely untrue. There is an extent to which the parts of the GNU that are not working are those parts that are led by the ANC. And of course, going forward, and as we get closer to both the 2026 and the 2029 elections, the DA is going to ramp up this message that the parts where, as the GNU, have not done well are those parts that are led by the ANC.
Yeah.
And those parts where we're doing well are those parts that are led by DA ministers. Now, the problem for the ANC is precisely that I don't think it's completely untrue that the parts that are not working are the parts that are led by ANC ministers. Where they're talking about policing, mining and minerals. Look at the current saga of the Stilfontein illegal miners. Look at how inept the government has been in how it has been communicating in relation to that. So in that respect, the DA does have a point. So we are going to have a contest between the DA and the ANC when it comes to, is it the parts that are led by the ANC or the parts that are led by the DA which explain the successes of the DA? Is it the parts that are led by the DA or the parts that are led by the ANC which explain the failures of the DA? So the unity of opposites and the struggle between strategic competition and strategic cooperation, it is in those ways that it is going to manifest going forward.
On that note, Gogo, can I take you to the ANC itself?
Yes.
Because you've already alluded to the fact that many in the ANC, we don't know exactly how many, would have found this cooperation with the DA unpalatable.
Yes.
And going forward, the story of the next few years will probably be, at least as far as ANC politics is concerned, just how many people are prepared to stomach this alliance with the DA. Added to that is that the ANC itself is starting to enter succession mode if you look closely enough. And in fact, Helen Ziller said to me that I asked her what are the biggest milestones on the road to the next election, and she said the ANC leadership election.
Yes. Who will succeed Ramaphosa? Yes.
So how do you see politics inside the ANC in this new era of ANC-DA cooperation?
Well, may I stay just for 1 second on the question of strategic cooperation and strategic competition. When you look at what is happening within the Tripartite Alliance, you can also look at it in terms of the dynamic of strategic cooperation and competition between the DA and the ANC. I've said that there's a tactical alliance between the DA and the ANC, which has been necessitated by various factors. Undoubtedly, this happens at a time when the Tripartite Alliance of the ANC, COSATU, and the SACP seem to be in the process of unraveling, which means there is another element of strategic competition that's going to emerge in the context of the GNU and future incarnations of the GNU, if we're going to have future incarnations. The tactical alliance between the ANC and the DA, there's going to come a point where it begins to challenge the strategic alliance between the ANC, the SACP, and COSATU. In this way, today, it may not be obvious, but it is obvious to me that one of the biggest, if not the biggest question of South African politics is the question, what is the strategic center? Now, the tensions that you are beginning to see within the alliance and arguments about the need to reconfigure it have arisen precisely because of disagreement about whether it is the ANC or the Tripartite Alliance that should constitute the strategic center. Now, there is a fear that to the extent that some regard the Tripartite Alliance as the strategic center, which it is not, but to the extent that you have people in the alliance who regard the Tripartite Alliance as a strategic center, there is a fear that this element will relocate from the Tripartite Alliance to the tactical alliance between the ANC and the DA. In other words, there is a fear that the alliance between the ANC and the DA will substitute the Tripartite Alliance as the strategic center. That's the main fear that is driving some of the tensions you see in terms of the unraveling of the Tripartite Alliance at the moment.
What do you make of the SACP's announcement that it's prepared to contest elections on its own?
It's umbrella after the rain. In this way, you may remember that Buti Matamela, who is now, I think, a deputy minister, was the secretary of the Young Communist League at a time when the Young Communist League consistently made the argument that in electoral terms, the SACP must de-link from the ANC. and contest elections independently. Of course, the SACP establishment was against this idea. I may have said this at the time, that when people like Buti Manamela grow up and have not been so seduced by power in the ANC, will in fact return to this question. And when they do, and if their position is hegemonic in the ANC and the alliance and the SACP, then the SACP will take a decision to contest elections independently. Now, I say this is taking out an umbrella after the rain, because I think the SACP has lost the strategic initiative when it comes to this question. I think there were moments in the past 30 years, if the SACP had taken the opportunity to contest elections independently, it would have done much better than it will in future. Now, let me counter my own argument. Let me show you why this argument may be nonsensical. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, an important change happens. And when Francis Fukuyama declares that what we're looking at after the fall of the Berlin Wall is the end of history, of course he was wrong. But anyway, there was a sense when the Berlin Wall collapsed that if not history itself, a particular phase of history is coming to an end. And one of the things that happens is that what is left of the left needed to find a new path for itself. In some domestic terrains, that manifested as a debate about what is the path to power in those domestic terrains for the left. Even at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the class position of workers was a predictor of their political preference. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, you could no longer say the class position of workers is a predictor of their political preferences. An example, in the UK, you could safely make the assumption that because of their class position, workers will go with Labour. And here, at the time, I think you would have made the argument that because of their class position, workers will go with the SACP as a vanguard of the working class. Now, why am I countering my own argument? I'm saying maybe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was never a time when the SACP seceding from its electoral bond with the ANC would have done better than it will in future, given how at global level dynamics had changed to the disadvantage of the global left and the left in certain domestic terrains, including ours. So that's my counter to my own argument. But maybe there was never a time during the past 30 years when the SACP would have contested elections independently and would have done much better than it will in future. So you have here another tension. You have a Communist Party that says it is the vanguard party of workers, which is in alliance with a national liberation movement that says it is the leader of society. Now, for too long, we looked at these two positions at face value. An SACP that ostensibly is the vanguard party of workers, and ANC that ostensibly is the leader of society. Which of the two has been true? In my view, neither. In fact, as we get closer and closer to the 2024 elections, these two positions become less and less true. So it is not true that the ANC is the leader of society, nor is it true that the SACP is the vanguard party of workers. Because what we were taught in the ANC and the SACP is that you don't become by declaration. So you don't become a vanguard party of workers by declaration. You don't declare yourself into such a position. You also don't declare yourself into becoming the leader of the of society if you are the ANC. So neither position is true as we approach the 2024 elections. So my other counter to my own argument is this. If I am correct in saying the SACP, as we approach the 2024 elections, is not a vanguard party of workers, it is only so because by declaration. But in reality and in essence, it isn't. If I'm correct, and if I'm correct that the ANC is not the leader of society, then I must be correct in thinking that the social distance that has developed between the SACP and the rest of society reflects the social distance that has developed between the SACP and the working class, thus compromising the idea that the SACP is a vanguard party of workers. Now, if I'm right on both counts, it is highly unlikely, therefore, that the SACP will attract a sizable number of workers and a sizable number outside the working class to vote for it in an election and be a serious challenger for state power.
The SACP comments and threats of splitting are part of a wider drama of contestation within the alliance and within the ANC. So returning to that battle, as I see it, and feel free to disagree, 2027, wherever that may be, maybe the ANC should just go back to Polokwane for old time's sake.
I think so. Yeah. Well, I suspect it is the MK part that will be happy with going to Polokwane in 2027.
That gathering, which is going to be quite momentous, at least for the ANC, is going to be a battle between those who think that this was a good idea, this alliance with the DA was a good idea, and those who think it was a historic betrayal. And the SACP may form part of those forces within the alliance and the ANC which are pushing the betrayal narrative, while those who are within the GNU and who maybe still gather around the figure of Ramaphosa, even if he isn't contesting, will be those who say that this was the correct decision.
So let's go back to the 2010 NGC. One of the raging debates at the time is around this question. I say is a key question of South African politics today. It's about whether it is the alliance or the ANC that is the strategic center. Now, remember, there is another context to this. Erroneously, the Zuma coalition, consisting of, amongst others, the SACP and COSATU, erroneously declare that Jacob Zuma is a candidate of the left. I argue at the time, and I still insist this is the case even today.
Yeah.
And that is why we should be a bit more critical about what Zuma is saying today. I argue at the time that if a doctor were to examine Jacob Zuma, such a doctor would not find a single left-wing bone in his body. So declaring Zuma a candidate of the left was a huge strategic error on the part of the SACP and COSATU. And some in 2010 become unhappy because Zuma makes a statement which, according to them, amounted to a betrayal. That after all the support they gave him and installed him as ANC president in Polokwane and head of state in 2009, he turns around, and he was quite emphatic, if you remember. He says there's only one strategic center. It is the ANC. He's unequivocal in saying that. And that matter has not been settled. And the current interactions within the alliance, for me, primarily are about this question. The SACP and COSATU. Now, COSATU has become a poodle. I don't know whether COSATU is a poodle of the SACP or a poodle of the ANC, but it is a poodle. In a way, the less said about COSATU, the better, actually. So, for the SACP, which in its own way has become a poodle in alliance politics, it is the alliance that must be the strategic center. Not any single component of the alliance, but the alliance as a collective must be the strategic center. Now, of course, that argument is both good and bad. In an alliance that is strong, such an alliance would be a good strategic center, processing tactical, strategic, ideological, and political decisions correctly. A weak alliance can be a strategic center. Now, this alliance is weak, partly because the components of the alliance individually are weak. COSATU is weak, the SACP is weak, and the ANC is weak. And maybe, if truth be told, the alliance is irrelevant in today's politics. So, maybe the current interactions are not going to excite the popular imagination precisely because the alliance is a legend only in its own head. It's quite possible the alliance is irrelevant at the moment. It is weak because the components that form it are weak. The ANC is weak, SACP is weak, COSATU is weak. Therefore, the alliance is weak. And therefore, there's an extent to which it can be argued that the question of the alliance as a strategic center does not arise. And the question of the ANC as a strategic center does not arise either, because it is too weak to be a strategic center itself. And it is too weak to be a leader of society, and it is too weak to be a leader of the alliance.
No ANC president has managed to consolidate their power and anoint their successor in democratic history. Former President Mbeki, despite the highs that he reached in governance and economic growth, faced a revolt after his second term in Polokwane. President Zuma, despite his strategic brilliance, suffered a defeat when Ramaphosa overtook a candidate that he supported.
Yes.
President Ramaphosa is an interesting one because his resurrection after the election is something to behold, firstly. I mean, lest we forget, people were saying he should resign when those results came out at the results center in the middle of this year. But he's proved himself ruthless, wily, far-sighted leader when it comes to negotiating for power, both inside the ANC and the state. Do you think he would be able to anoint a successor, or at least see a leadership transition that would not result in a revolt against his leadership come the end of this term? Or do you think that history will repeat itself?
Well, I have said many an impolite thing about Ramaphosa.
Welcome to the club.
One of them, and I still maintain this is true in my view. I argued before the 2017 National Conference of the ANC that one of the problems is that Ramaphosa is not presidential material, and I still maintain that is the case. I don't think it's presidential material. That said, I would be a fool not to concede that in my view, since 1990, this is the president of the ANC who has had the strongest hold over the party.
Wow.
In my view. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just stating what I think is a fact.
Sure.
I don't think whether you look at Mandela, whether you look at... Because I don't count Mandela to the extent that there was a lot that was mythical about Mandela. So I don't count Mandela.
Yeah.
So I start with Mbeki. You look at Mbeki, okay, Kgalema Motlanthe was not an ANC president, was head of state for 7 months. You look at Zuma. For me, it is Ramaphosa who has had the strongest hold over the party. He seems to have understood what his predecessors failed to understand, particularly Mbeki, by the way, who I would have thought would have been much more strategic than all of them. But in some way was the least strategic, and that is why he lost in Polokwane. Ramaphosa seems to have understood that being in control of the state is meaningless if you are not in control of the party. So Ramaphosa, when I compare him to his predecessors, is the one ANC leader who has a hold on both the state and the party. Now, of course, the question is, what has he done with that power? Not much.
Yeah, that's the frustrating thing.
Not much. He has nothing to show. The country has nothing to show for the fact that we have this man who, in my view, is the only one since 1990 who understands that he must control the state and the party. Because to control the party without having control over the state is meaningless. And to control the state without having control over the party is equally meaningless. He seems to have understood that. But the ends to which he has exercised his power is another question altogether. I think we have very little to show in terms of progress in the ANC and progress in the country and progress in the state are concerned. So, at face value, and remember these days, to be political is to stay on the surface. So at face value, Ramaphosa is a dead man walking. He's a lame duck. Members of the party are in the process of speculating about who's going to succeed him, because he is not going to be head of state in 2029. Who is going to be head of state in 2029? Now, that question used to be much easier until May.
Absolutely.
The import of that question since May has changed.
Yeah.
Because that question only applied to dynamics inside the ANC.
Yeah.
That's no longer the case. We have to look at what's happening inside the ANC and outside, in case our electoral politics produce a head of state who's not from the ANC.
Yeah.
You know? So the question Helen Zille raises when you ask her about, I think I asked her about what milestones
Yeah. Yeah.
should you look at. And the question she raises about looking at who is going to succeed Ramaphosa is important.
Yeah.
Because you must remember why the ANC fell below 40% in May. And the answer is, I think, in the first episode of our election trilogy, when we talked about the fact that the outcome of the May election is going to be shaped not by votes, but by money. So in part, the result of the May 2024 elections is engineered by capital. And maybe let me commit the sin of dabbling in critical race theory, even if it is at an elementary level. White capital makes a decision that is based on a strategic position that was taken in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, in the context of liberalism international, many thinkers within that fold come to the conclusion that they must start preparing the DP at some point, the DA now, for state power. They start painting scenarios in which the Democratic Alliance will become a future ruling party, rising on the ashes of the ANC. And one of the tactical maneuvers they suggest is that the ANC must be allowed to self-destruct. And self-destruct it did. The tactical maneuver that the ANC will self-destruct, will lose credibility, and that gap must be taken to ensure that a wedge is driven decisively between the ANC and its supporters and those who have been voting for it since 1994. So in 2024, or in the lead up to the 2024 elections, the strategic position that is taken is that the black vote must be split. Because in splitting the black vote, you lower the percentage vote of the ANC. So the DA does not have to win an outright majority. All you need is for the ANC to fall below 50. You impose a coalition arrangement, and the DA will be at the center of that arrangement. And remember, to some extent, there are two parties of liberalism in South Africa, the ANC and the DA, especially when it comes to economic policy. You have two parties that believe in a market-led economy, the DA and the ANC. Or let me say, the faction in the ANC that believes in a market economy has become hegemonic. Now, that means for white capital, half the battle is won already by the time we approach the lead-up of the 2024 May election, because the DA does not have to win an outright majority, because the interests, particularly the economic interests of the constituency it represents, have been advanced and will continue to some extent being advanced by the ANC or through the ANC. So capital was a critical political player in the lead up to this election. So you manufacture the idea that a party like Rise Mzansi or BOSA will constitute an effective challenge. Not because this is true, because you know that what is true is that some votes that otherwise would have gone to the ANC will go to BOSA, some will go to Rise Mzansi, and a plethora of other small parties, the effect of which is to push the ANC, pull the ANC below 50. And you can then impose this coalition arrangement on the country. You can impose something else, an ANC-DA coalition, which is what has happened. Now, who is a critical player in this strategy? A critical player in this strategy is Cyril Ramaphosa. Capital has always tried to de-link the ANC leader from the ANC. They tried it with Mandela, they tried it with Mbeki, and they continued with the Ramaphosa. So you de-link Ramaphosa from a particular incarnation of the ANC. And this incarnation is an ANC that at times has flirted with what some elements of capital have nervously thought was a flirtation with socialism or communism, you know. And if you promote Ramaphosa, there is a chance that an ANC created in his image will full force be in support of a market economy. And so when Helen Zille asks, who will succeed Ramaphosa? In my view, it is primarily with regard to the economy. What kind of leader will emerge, and what will be the orientation of that leader in relation to economic policy, in relation to the question of land, and in relation to the question of the rule of law, in relation to things like Section 25 of the property clause of the Constitution. So, in a way, the question Helen Zille is posing is about ensuring that whoever replaces Ramaphosa is not a leader of the ANC who will deviate from the current course, a course from which the DA and capital are benefiting. But it's also important in terms of international relations. South Africa is a Western country, firmly within the Western sphere of influence. And falling within that Western sphere of influence has certain implications. It has implications for foreign policy. it has implications for the content of economic policy. And therefore, the person who emerges as leader of the ANC must be one who is not going to deviate from a course that benefits capital and the DA when it comes to the benefits of falling within the Western sphere of influence. Now, of course, the argument I'm making makes sense only if that leader becomes head of state. It doesn't make sense if the next leader of the ANC is not going to be head of state.
Yeah.
But it also doesn't make sense in the context of what capital has always wanted. As much as capital has always had a problem with the ANC's ideological orientation when it comes to issues like economic policy, for me, unnecessarily so, but there were nervous at times about that. If Ramaphosa's successor is not going to be head of state, this argument doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if Ramaphosa's successor is going to be head of state. Otherwise, the arguments I've just made do not arise.
Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. Well, Gogo, we've spoken about the GNU, the ANC, the DA, and this coalition government, but perhaps the story of this year, I hasten to say as predicted by us, but let me not, is the MK party.
Yes.
I'll just start with this question and we'll see where we go from here. Is President Zuma done?
We answered that question, I think, in episode 3 of the trilogy.
Yeah.
We said Zuma is not done. You do know that there's a certain section of our media that has declared Ramaphosa, I think, person of the year.
Yeah. The decade, actually.
Is it decade? And Zuma, the villain. Now, of course, we keep on falling into the same trap of villains and angels and demons. And I will repeat something I've said on so many occasions. But politics is seldom reducible to a battle between angels and demons. Politics almost always is characterized by a battle between angels with horns and devils with halos. So to the extent that you decide that Ramaphosa is person of the decade, you must also answer the question, is he an angel with horns or a devil with a halo? And to the extent that you have decided that Zuma is a villain, you must engage with the same question when it comes to him. I must say, though, this is one of the most exciting times to be a political animal in South Africa. Our politics is a gift that keeps on giving. And MK, no doubt about it, is the newsmaker of the year. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
You know. What I found interesting over the past few weeks is that Julius Malema has been launching a massive attack on the MK Party and Zuma. I suspect out of the belief that the MK Party has become a thievery corporation. Given the number of leaders and others who have left the EFF to join the MK Party. Now, what is happening here? Is this just a story of an EFF that is angry that it is losing members to the MK Party? Or is something much deeper going on here? I think something much deeper is happening. And I think it's going to take shape much more decisively over the next decade. Remember that the EFF projects itself not only as the vanguard of the working class, not only as a Marxist or even Marxist-Leninist formation, but also as the champion of black people, or Africans, or both. Now, the MK Party itself has been making left-leaning noises. Both the EFF and the MK Party are trying to position themselves on the left of the ANC. The contest here between the MK Party and the EFF, amongst other things, is about whether it is the EFF or the MK Party that is offering a radical option and vision for South Africa's future. That is one of the main contests between the two parties. And then there's another battle. Is it the MK Party or the EFF that is the true champion of progressive politics? I suspect that both the EFF and the MK Party want to be custodians of progressive politics, not only in South Africa, but in the region and the continent as a whole. Maybe with a certain element of a global reach too. Now, of course, the idea of progressive what constitutes progressive politics has become both nebulous and contested. Now, I've listened since the formation of the GNU to the Progressive Caucus, trying to explain to the country what progressive politics is about. And the reason I say the idea of progressive politics is nebulous and maybe also incoherent. From what I've heard so far, I can't give you a clear sense of what progressive politics in this, I'll use a very good ANC word, in this conjuncture. I can't tell you what progressive politics is supposedly about when I listen to those who say they're part of a progressive caucus. And when I look at some of those who are part of the progressive caucus, their gender politics makes me wonder whether we can call them progressive. Even their race politics, by the way. Some attempts by some leaders of the EFF to engage with critical race theory, I have found them problematic, not progressive, problematic. And some engagement with the question of gender. I found it problematic too. And then there's the question of the LGBTQI. When I look at both, some of the sounds that are coming out of the EFF leadership and coming out of the MK party leadership on the question of LGBTQI politics, I have found them wanting. When I think of all these things, I then ask the question, what makes them progressive? What do they mean when they say they are custodians or proponents of progressive politics? But let's focus narrowly on the battle between the EFF and the MK party. As I said, I do think that over the next decade or two, we're going to see the reconfiguration of South Africa's political landscape taking a much more decisive shape.
Wow.
In fact, I am looking at, remember that in 20 years, we'll be celebrating 50 years of our democracy. What will South Africa look like? The question that precedes that, what will the balance of forces in our political landscape look like when South Africa celebrates 50 years of democracy? We are going to see some consolidation, not reconsolidation, some consolidation. In one scenario, I see consolidation taking place around the EFF and the MK party. Now, that scenario only holds, by the way, if the EFF does not implode. There's a very strong possibility that in the next decade or two, the EFF will implode. There's also a good possibility that the MK may implode the MK party. Now, the scenario in which consolidation takes place around the EFF and the MK party only makes sense assuming that neither implodes. But if they implode, the scenario of a consolidation around the two parties doesn't take place. Now, if they don't implode, and we see consolidation taking place around the EFF and the MK party, in other words, we see a realignment in our politics taking shape around a more powerful EFF and MK party separately and together. If that happens, at the same time, something else will happen. Competition between the EFF and MK will not stop.
Yeah.
So both dynamics will coincide. The dynamic of consolidation and competition between the EFF and MK will coincide, in my view. But that, I think, at some point, at certain periods over the next 2 decades, will coincide with another consolidation. consolidation around the DA and the ANC. And the two strands of consolidation come into conflict with one another at some point. Conflict with the small letter C as they compete for a hegemonic position in our electoral politics to emerge as the points around which future governments are formed. With the large C, if the conflict is not peaceful. I don't think it will not be peaceful, by the way. But you never know. I think it will be peaceful, but you never know. So I think we're looking at a conflict between these two poles. One pole is consolidation around the ANC and the DA, and the other pole is consolidation around the EFF and the MK party. And there's competition or even conflict between the two poles. But I think the conflict will be peaceful. Now, in both cases, that of consolidation around the ANC and the DA, and that of consolidation around the EFF and MK, you have this coincidence of consolidation and competition. So the DA and the ANC will continue forming tactical alliances, but will not stop competing. Because they will not stop, the ANC will not stop preparing for conditions in which it wins an absolute majority. And the DA will not stop working for conditions under which it wins an absolute majority. So the two tendencies will coincide. The tendency to form tactical alliances and the tendency to compete. And then, of course, you'll have the third tendency, competition between the two poles around which consolidation is going to happen. Now, of course, one of the main contradictions in South African society today is about a conflict that is caused by competing perspectives about what constitutes a civilized order. So these two poles, the ANC-DA pole and the EFF-MK pole, will at some point over the next 2 decades constitute the main center around which this conflict occurs when it comes to conflicting perspectives about what constitutes a civilized order for this country. A civilized order economically, a civilized order socially, a civilized order about how we share resources such as land, how we engage with issues of the rule of law, the constitution, and all of that. So these two poles will represent opposing perspectives when it comes to what constitutes a civilized order in South Africa. Now, I'm not ruling out a possibility that in the scenario where the EFF does not implode and the MK party does not implode, I am not ruling out the possibility that the MK party emerges as the majority party in South Africa.
Sure.
The reason why I'm not ruling out that possibility is that it is highly unlikely that the current incarnation of the government of national unity and future incarnations of the government of national unity with different variations, of course. I am not convinced they are going to deliver sufficiently on the promise of a better life for all South Africans. Which means, to the extent that in part this election was about South African voters looking for an alternative to both the ANC and the DA. If I'm right about the GNU, that search will continue over the next 2 decades. And who knows, the outcome of that search may produce a government of the MK party, an MK party that wins an absolute majority. Yes.
What did you make of Floyd Shivambu's move? Because I think that was probably one of the biggest moments in South African politics this year, if not for many years to come. I think this year will be about the election, the formation of the government, and MK, but also the move from EFF to MK. And I don't know if we've diagnosed and reflected on that move sufficiently, because it confounded my expectations. I'll be the first to admit. When I heard that, I was truly shocked.
I wasn't. For me, it has been coming for a long time. I will say this. I think we can say this now.
Yeah.
There has been a whispering campaign against Floyd Shivambu for many years within the EFF. I will not venture into who was behind the whispering campaign, even though my sources at different times have told me who was behind the whispering campaign. I think for me, what is more important is the content of the whispering campaign. And for quite a long time, since 2013, the sense I got was that he was not trusted in certain quarters within the EFF. In fact, there were even suggestions that he's an ANC plant. Now, those suggestions, by the way, have been resuscitated since he left. We've always known that he's not one of us. We've always known that he's a mole, he's an ANC plant. So that has been with us since 2013. Looking at that and other dynamics around Floyd Shivambu since 2013, I've been expecting this for quite some time. I will say this only because I've said it publicly before in another interview. I have argued that Julius Malema is the greatest asset of the EFF. I have also argued that Julius Malema is the greatest threat to the EFF and the greatest weakness of the EFF. I have argued that. I still maintain that is the case. That he is the greatest asset to the EFF, less so after this election, by the way. He is not an asset to the EFF in the way I would have said he was prior to this election. But as we went into this election, my own calculation is that he had become more a threat than an asset to the EFF. And simply because there is one thing our political parties don't do well, particularly those who come out of the heritage of the liberation struggle. And here I'm talking about the ANC, I'm talking about the MK Party, and I'm talking about the EFF. One thing they're not good at is managing the strengths and the weaknesses of the leader. I see it in MK. One of the reasons MK may implode is precisely because the MK Party is not good at managing the strengths and weaknesses of its leader. Very few organizations at a collective level survive the weaknesses of the leader. But many organizations will do better despite the weaknesses of the leader, if those weaknesses are managed well and the strengths of such a leader are managed well. But I find that with the ANC and with MK and the EFF, there is a failure to manage the weaknesses of the leader and a failure to foreground more effective the strengths of the leaders. And I'm not surprised. There has been a conscious and an unconscious internalization of the liberation movement model by the MK Party, by the ANC, and by the EFF. Unfortunately, this internalization has happened also with regard to elements of the liberation movement model that I find pernicious. Just to touch on one or two elements of the liberation movement model. The liberation movement is the people, and the people are the liberation movement. The liberation movement will always act in the best interest of the people, and the people in turn will always act in the best interests of the liberation movement, because the two sets of interests are not separable. At its worst, the liberation movement says the leader is the liberation movement, and the liberation movement is the leader. I've seen this in the ANC. I see it in the MK Party today. I've seen it in the EFF. So these parties that come from this heritage have internalized things about the liberation movement model they shouldn't internalize because they're problematic. Because one of the things the liberation movement model did not take into account sufficiently is that of the agency of those on whose behalf they act, or those they purport to represent, or whose interests they represent. So the language used by the ANC in the language of the National Democratic Revolution is that the people are the key motive force of the revolution. Now, when you listen to the EFF and the MK Party, you hear variations on the same theme. MK Party, black people or Africans. There are times when the MK Party distinguishes between the two. There are times when it doesn't. So black people, in their incarnation as Africans in particular, or black in general, are the key motive force of the revolution. Using different language, the EFF says similar things. But the EFF, the MK Party, and the ANC, in their analysis, what they have not done enough is to engage with the fact. And the fact is this. It is the sense of independence and agency of this so-called motive force of the revolution. It takes the ANC too long to see that there has been a process in which the motive force of the revolution, the people, begin to decouple their interests from the interests of the liberation movement. In the end, the ANC falls below 50% or below 40% in May, because the process of decoupling reaches its height with this election. The key motive force of the revolution, the people, have decoupled their interests from the interests of the liberation movement so much that they can't countenance having the ANC winning an absolute majority in this country. Now, of course, the implications are different for the EFF, the MK Party, and the ANC for their failure to see that the key motive force of the revolution is independent, and at times will exercise its independence in a manner that is at variance with the interests of the liberation movement. So the MK Party, because it is a new party, needs to realize, while there's still time, that it must not make the same mistake of not recognizing that those on whose behalf they claim they are engaging in struggle have a sense of independence and agency. And if the content of the struggle does not coincide with their perception of social, political, and economic reality, and their understanding of what it means to act in their best interests, you will see the same decoupling you saw with regard to the ANC. And the MK Party, because it is a new party, must even be more careful because it does not have a track record. It may be in the process of articulating its vision. If the articulation is poor, that those on whose behalf it claims it is engaging in struggle may start decoupling their interests from the MK Party. With the EFF, I think that process has already started. I think in relation to the constituents the EFF claims to represent, the EFF is already losing the argument. So, over the next decade, the main challenge facing the EFF is that of reconnecting with the interests of this constituents. And the same, to some extent, applies to the ANC. Back to the SACP and contesting elections independently. I think I heard the SACP saying what they have to decide in their upcoming national conference is which logo they are going to use in 2026 if the idea that they should contest elections independently is endorsed by conference. I laugh because when I listen, there's something I don't hear. It is the realization that the ANC has caused collateral damage to the image of the SACP. It is going to be difficult for voters to separate the SACP from the ANC. It is going to be difficult for voters to separate the SACP from what the ANC has become. I think for too many voters, in relation to what the ANC has become, the SACP is part of the problem. So for me, the challenge, yes, is that of reconfiguring the alliance, but the ANC must have a conversation about how it is going to reconfigure itself. The SACP, must have conversations about its own reconfiguration. It needs to reconfigure itself. It needs to reposition itself. Now, going back to the current directions, I have never understood it to be the case that the Tripartite Alliance will last forever. It has always been my understanding that two conditions, or one of two conditions, will necessitate the collapse of the alliance. One, when the alliance has achieved its historical mission. And when I look at, I've already said the alliance is weak and its components are weak. Partly because of that, the alliance is very far from attaining the goal of completing its historical mission. In fact, the SACP is even much further when it comes to the goal of attaining the goal of creating a communist society, let alone the goal of total liberation, So, unfortunately for the SACP, the ANC has caused collateral damage to its own image. It needs to cleanse itself of its ANC-ness. ANC ingcolisile, to put it in a sizzle. The ANC has made the SACP dead. You know what they say about, they say sleeping with fleas or lying with fleas? In effect, if you look at what the ANC has become, the ANC has become flea-infested. So to be part of the Tripartite Alliance with the ANC for the SACP has meant it has been lying with fleas. So voters can see the fleas on both the part of the ANC and the SACP. So the first thing the SACP will have to do is to cleanse itself of the ANC fleas and reposition itself, reconfigure itself, if it is to attract a sizable number of voters. As matters stand, I don't think the SACP is about to become a potent political force when it comes to our electoral politics.
Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. Can I ask you a question about Julius Malema and Jacob Zuma?
Yes.
In many ways, politics over the last 25 years, 20 years has been the story of a battle between those two in some ways. And in fact, I think the election, we might look back at it as a fascinating moment of convergence between the two, which we last saw at Polokwane, a very short moment. And they've converged and they've diverged and they've converged and they've diverged. I wonder if either has forgiven the other. And we saw them able to paper over the cracks of that lack of forgiveness for a period. But I don't know if Julius Malema has ever forgiven Jacob Zuma for the removal.
Expulsion.
Yeah, the expulsion, which must have hurt. And I don't know if Jacob Zuma will ever forgive Julius Malema for his expulsion from the presidency, where Malema played a crucial role. And so, despite the fact that the ideological positions are drawing them together, and the GNU is pushing them together by keeping them out, those interpersonal rivalries and histories seem to be really bitter and a cause of this great conflict that we're seeing. Now throw on top of that the moves from MK to EFF, and I get the sense there's a deep personal story there that hasn't been fully resolved.
While I agree that we should not focus too much on personalities, what we do, we move from that to another problematic position. And it is a position where we engage in all manner of high analysis. A high analysis that sometimes misses the centrality of the personal in politics. So you are right. The personal in the relationship between the EFF and the MK party is not unimportant. Some might say is important. We were taught in the ANC, and I hope we're taught successfully, we were taught never to personalize political differences and never to politicize personal differences. We're taught that. And what I'm hearing here in this twist between the EFF and the MK party is exactly that. Personal differences are being politicized and political differences are being personalized. For me, you have the moment when Julius says he can kill for Zuma. But there's a moment people did not realize. From around 2009, in fact, my observation would be in the months leading up to the 2009 election, there is something that happens which, when I looked at, I thought, Zuma can't be happy with this. Increasingly, when Julius Malema introduces Jacob Zuma, and I remember at one point we're at Monte Cassino in an ANC forum organized for professionals. In those days, people still thought of me as a professional. So there I was sitting in the audience, and Julius Malema is on stage talking. And the sense I got was, Julius does not understand the sociology of KwaZulu-Natal. There are ways in which you don't talk about a man such as Zuma. And to me, he was talking about Zuma as if Zuma is a small boy, is his object. And I sat there thinking, there's a quarrel brewing here. Zuma is not going to take this indefinitely. There is going to come a time when he will want to rebalance the scales, you know. And also, our politics is not only patriarchal. There's a very strong smell of testosterone in our politics. A lot of machismo in our politics. And when I listen to the insults being thrown between former EFF members in the MK party and the EFF, the smell of testosterone is overwhelming. The machismo and bravado are overwhelming. So this story is not going to end well. So I have a fear, a new fear. We now have paid back the money 2.0. The EFF says we're going to attach Nkandla. Now, of course, the language is grandiose and hyperbolic. So, and maybe deliberate. You don't say we're going to attach Zuma's homestead. You're going to attach Nkandla. You know? Now, how that lands to Zuma supporters is problematic, because Nkandla is a metaphor for power. Whose power? Zuma's power. And it's also a metaphor for something else. Jacob Zuma is not just the leader of this new powerful party. Jacob Zuma is also the leader of the Zulus. An attack on Jacob Zuma is not only an attack on the MK party. It may land in the ears of some as an attack on Zulus. Now, of course, when we talked about the fact that in 2009, the Zulu nationalist impulse migrated from the IFP to the ANC because Zuma had been elected ANC president in 2007. And then we talked about how that Zulu nationalist impulse is now migrating from the ANC to the MK party. People are touched in their studio. And for me, the reasons where they are touched in their studio makes no logical sense. In this sense, the fact that we are not a puppet does not mean ventriloquists have become extinct. So the fact that you are not a tribalist, or you pretend you are not tribalist, does not mean tribalists have become extinct. So the fact that you are not a Zulu nationalist, or you pretend you are not a Zulu nationalist, does not mean Zulu nationalism has become extinct. So people being touched in the studio by this argument makes no logical sense to me. And because what I'm stating is just a fact. In 2009, the Zulu nationalist impulse migrates from the IFP to the ANC. And in this election, it migrated from the ANC to the MK party. Now, when I hear Malema talking about how they're going to attach Nkandla, I start thinking, he's playing with matches. He's playing with fire. Because in some years that is landing as nothing but provocation. So a dynamic in KZN and Gauteng may develop between the EFF and the MK party. That may be because of political instability in the two provinces. This is not a time for intemperate statements on the part of EFF and the MK party. I think it is Anna or Anne Arends who says that when a conflict is intimate, it tends to be quite fierce. So the conflict between members of the MK party who come from the EFF and the EFF is intimate, and therefore it's going to be quite vicious. And to your point, it's intimate because it is personal. So the fact that there's a twist that is quite personal between some leaders of the EFF and some leaders of the MK party. The fact that the twist is personal means that the conflict will be vicious. Now, let's zoom in on Floyd. That is one of the most important events of the year. That is Floyd leaving the EFF. Now, division of labor in political parties can either occur organically or it may be a product of conscious decisions. Julius Malema is a gifted politician. And I don't say this approvingly all the time.
Absolutely.
There are times I think he's a gifted politician for all the wrong reasons, because of all that is wrong about politics and politicians. But he is a gifted politician.
Absolutely.
Perversely and otherwise. Floyd Shivambu is not Julius Malema. Doesn't come with the same charisma. Doesn't come with the same gift. Doesn't have the same gift of Julius Malema. You know? So there's a division of labor that emerges in the EFF. Julius Malema, the leader. But also remember that relationship between Floyd and Julius. Julius as the leader, or the voorpert, so to speak, comes from the Youth League, from their time in the Youth League. And there was something feudal, by the way, about the relationship between Julius Malema as president of the Youth League and the rest of the Youth League. In my observation, members of the Youth League related to Julius as if they were relating to a monarch. And I think that tendency migrated to the EFF. And I think that tendency has not always served the EFF. And it's one of the problems with the EFF, in my view. This feudal relationship between the leader and the rest of the party. Now, in terms of this division of labor I'm talking about, Floyd Shivambu is the brains. This is not the man who's going to wow a crowd. But this is the man who's going to give content to the one who wows the crowd. Managing that relationship requires a lot of maturity. In a leader that is insecure, someone like Floyd becomes a threat. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened here. I don't know. Maybe that's what happened here. But a lack of maturity can produce two things. You have this gifted leader who can wow a crowd, who is charismatic and all of that, who cannot tolerate the fact that the gifts of a particular type of intelligence lie not with him, but with someone like Floyd. Now, with someone like Floyd, again, I'm not saying this is what happened, but if we're doing an analysis with them, I would investigate whether this is the case. Is this what happened? With someone like Floyd, there comes a time when intelligent people worship the intellect. This tendency is at its worst when they start worshipping their own intellect. Once they start worshipping their own intellect, they are on their way to conflict between them and those who are threatened by that intellect. This is what may or may not have happened to the EFF, to the relationship between Floyd and Malema. Now, managing that kind of relationship, as I said, requires a lot of maturity. A maturity that may not have always existed in this relationship. Now, the fact that certain gifts of leadership reside in Julius, not in Floyd, may not have meant that Floyd has no great ambition. In other words, his ambitions are not limited to being a backroom guy who influences the content of policy and strategy. To your point about the personal in politics, I think we can safely say that at some point, personality clashes, overtly or otherwise, do emerge between the two. And the EFF becomes too small for the two of them. And therefore one of them has to exit. Now, if I'm correct with some of these suppositions, Floyd is going to run into the same problem in the MK party. His intellect is going to be the source of conflict between him and others in the MK party. I remember listening to an interview between Tim Modise and Thabo Mbeki's mother. And the last question he asks Thabo Mbeki's mother is, what advice would you give to your son? And Mrs. Mbeki says, he must listen to others. He is not the only one who has ideas. Others have ideas too. I would give the same advice to Floyd Shivambu. Otherwise, his time in the EFF, in the MK party, is not going to be a good time. Yeah.
Well, Gogo, I think that's all we have time for today. We have had the longest conversation we've ever had of 2 hours, but one that has spanned ANC, EFF, DA, MK party, and the future of the country in what has been a momentous year. And I think those who watch all of our conversations this year will have great insight into what this year means, not just in the moment, but historically.
Yes.
I think 25 is going to be a year when conflicts really break out that are threatening to break out. I hope not in violent ways.
Yes.
But I think the GNU starts to have its real debates, and the MK and the EFF against each other, and internally also start to have some very real debates.
Yes.
And I hope you'll be here to join us for what is set to be a fascinating year
Yeah,
ahead.
we also have an ANC NGC, which always signals what may happen in the national conference, in this case, in 2027.
I look forward to thinking through all of that with you, Gogo, but thank you so much for all of your insights this year. May you have a restful holiday period, and we look forward to all your insights in the years to come.
Thank you for the time SMWX has given me. All that is left to say is ayeye.
Well, I won't say it in that case. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for joining us. Thokoza Gogo.
Thokoza Keshe.